Hello, and welcome to the Project Good podcast. I'm your host, Anne Marie Hilton. Project Good is a social impact podcast interviewing experts and advocates about the pressing problems that we face globally and hearing how they suggest we move forward in the future. The Project Good podcast is brought to you by Project Good Work. The goal of this podcast is to inspire people and organizations to develop a mindset that can move others to positive action regarding the complex social issues facing people and the planet. For December, we're focusing on our organization of the year, Brilliant Detroit. During 2020, when the world began to change forever, no greater area in life was brought to the forefront than the outlook for future generations. In-person schooling was no longer available, and parents had to step up into additional roles at home. Some students fell behind due to lack of access to internet and school lunches. For parents with infants and toddlers, childcare was either unavailable or too expensive. Families all over the United States in many communities felt isolated and unsure how to move forward to ensure success for their children. One organization that existed years before the pandemic had already seen the future for the next generation and took charge by creating an organization, Brilliant Detroit, dedicated to building kids' successful families and neighborhoods in high-need areas in Detroit. The organization has a special connection within the communities it works with because they become intimately involved by becoming part of the residential neighborhood. This type of involvement has helped families who are part of their programs thrive. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Maria Montoya, who is the Strategic Communications and Systems Director at Brilliant Detroit, dedicated to working with the organization to help families be school-ready, healthy, and stable. Let's get into the interview. Brilliant Detroit, which is our organization of the year, is dedicated to building kids' success families and neighborhoods where families with children from 0 to 8 have what they need to be school-ready, healthy, and stable. The organization provides proven programming and support year-round out of Brilliant Detroit homes in high-need neighborhoods. The organization is revolutionizing what it means to be a community in today's world. Welcome, Maria.
Hi, thank you so much for having us, and thank you so much for this honor.
Yes, thank you. I'm so happy to learn more about Brilliant Detroit today, and thank you for being our organization of the year. So I always like to ask everyone that I interview a question before we jump into the questions. How did you start to get involved with Brilliant Detroit?
I think the magic of Brilliant is it's this space that's just so welcoming of folks as you are. And we like to say it's the orange door to where that magic exists. So every one of our hubs, we are kind of famous for painting it orange, and that is our Brilliant Detroit orange door. And once you come through there, it's just this, this is your home. No matter which hub you may land in, we currently have 18. We're working toward 24 by 2024. It's just like a very family atmosphere. And I moved here from another state. My husband was born and raised here in Michigan. And I happened upon, Brilliant Detroit's Brightmoor hub. And it was just a really awesome place for me and my children to feel like we were accepted, to feel like we could just come and be a part of community dinners. And was the first time in a long time that I really felt like, okay, we're going to be okay. There's friends here. There's people here. And I had met the founder previous to visiting the hub on my own. But I had just happened upon an activity, a community dinner, and took my kids, and it just was really magical experience for us, having moved here and not had that kind of friend base, especially friends with children. So I had a lot of friends who didn't have children yet, or friends whose children had already grown and moved on. So it was really a magical space that I, discovered, as a partner to the founder. Cindy Eggleton, had met her in meetings, but then as a parent, it was a really different experience to attend an event and attend that event with my children and feel like, the warmth and the love that exists in each of the hubs.
Wow. Okay. That's so you just instantly, it seems, I guess, felt community the minute that you walked in.
Yeah, just so welcoming. A lot of people are confused by our model because it actually is a house. The house is selected by neighbors and community who approach Brilliant Detroit and say, "Hey, we've heard about this. We want it for our neighborhood." And there's really a process that we have to go through and pick a house that's been abandoned or that is currently available in the city's land bank of houses, to secure that house and remodel it so that it can serve as the heart of activities and programs for any family in that neighborhood that has an infant to an 8-year-old. And so we don't take the house and take out the living room and the dining room and all those things. The house really gets remodeled with those things put back into it, and programming really exist in that kind of family fun way. There, are some basements in use in houses. A lot of the kitchens get used for meetings and, activities and trainings that the families want to take part in. And so it really is this kind of, house environment where you're welcome in. And people, I remember people, every inch of the couch was covered, every inch of the floor was covered. And, people were sitting and eating, and they had never seen us before, but they really welcomed, all three of my children in and said, grab yourself a plate, sit down wherever you can find a space, or,
Wow.
go play. And, that environment you don't always feel, even in public spaces. And that's one thing I like to share with folks. Everybody always says, in our libraries and our schools and all these things, there's these, public access to things there is a lot of public access here, I think, and across the United States. But what is that feeling that you have, and what kind of energy does a family experience when they walk into those spaces? And I think that's a really, magic sauce of Brilliant Detroit.
Okay. Wow. You start to bring back, I didn't obviously live in the era of the, like, 50s or something like that, but it kind of brought that kind of thought in my head of, like, of communities. Um, I guess, to start kind of diving into a little bit about how Brilliant Detroit came to be, I think for people who have maybe never been to Michigan, and definitely maybe not Detroit, kind of understand the area of Detroit. I know that you are somebody that had moved there, but is married to somebody who is a Detroit native. So kind of understanding, I guess, what is going on in Detroit will probably help people to understand why Brilliant Detroit needed to come to be, I guess.
Yeah,
So I guess,
definitely.
I know one of the, just before you jump in, and I know one of the things is hard because, we just, of course, have been going through this, like, pandemic thing. So I'm sure every area has changed a little bit, but in general, I guess, to give us kind of an overview of what's the makeup of Detroit like.
Yeah. So I always describe to folks that, I mean, it is just a really expansive city. I think, compared to most cities, where you can really get around in and about the city, I would say in 20 to 30 minutes. I would say the depth and the span of Detroit and how many communities exist within the city, and even other cities that exist within the city, is just really so expansive. And then you have 50% of our children who are under 5 or, still living, in poverty. Many of the neighborhoods, you have just this really strong, flourishing neighborhood in this community, that has existed for a long time. But there will be pockets, where you will see blight. There'll be pockets where you no longer see services or, access to usable grocery stores, or you might have childcare and schools that have actually closed up and been boarded up, but there's still, very much an active community living there.
Hmm.
I think there's this idea that everybody's kind of abandoned the city. If you often in the community work, we talk about how, there is this coverage of Detroit that it's this kind of abandoned city, and that's not really the case at all. There's always, a lot of stories about how downtown is growing, but I think one of the most vibrant things about the city is that you have so many very unique neighborhoods, where you have generations of families who either have bought and purchased homes, alongside each other, or they've rented for years in probably, a 2 to 3 kind of block radius of each other. And so I think that, the city is very much full, and the city very much has more than 100,000 kids, who are attending K 12. But then, in addition to that, we know there are thousands of youngsters who are also living, and that is really our focus: was how do we get to the children from the belly to 8 years old before they're generally activated into some school type program. And that's where the idea of the neighborhood based hubs really came. How do you bring quality programming and structured activities to the neighborhood instead of consistently putting the burden on families to seek out things outside of the neighborhood? Because as expansive as Detroit is, with Detroit winter and all the complexities that exist as far as maintaining and keeping highways functioning, it is really hard transportation wise for a lot of families to get out and about, given that there isn't, I would say, the most consistent bus service at this point. We definitely have, I think, expanded and seen things grow under Mayor Duggan. But I think that, for a lot of families, transportation, particularly if they have a lot of little ones, is harder. And so the idea behind Brilliant Detroit is, how do we create that community-based support year round in the neighborhoods? And so we don't close in the summer. We don't close, up for every holiday. And, when kids are out of school, we are generally trying to provide programs and activities. And I think another thing that's really special about this is, Detroit has had a lot of folks dropping in and out and trying to say, okay, here's the solution, that could help Detroit get back on its feet. And I think that's definitely the opposite of where we're coming from as an organization. We're really working with communities to say what is it that you think the solutions are? What are the activities? What are the programs that you would like to see for your family? Because we really believe that, the solutionaries in this are the folks who are actually living in the neighborhoods, and know their neighborhoods and their children best.
Yes, you bring up a lot of good points in, like, when I was doing research, or of course, talking to people who have, went to Detroit and left Detroit. Yes, I guess what I see from a media standpoint, and what I hear, of course, is that, Detroit seems like an abandoned city. But I also know that there is this whole movement for gentrification in Detroit, into kind of bring the city back to life, but differently. So you bring up a really good point that I think a lot of people are not aware of, or they don't think about, I guess we should say, is that there are people there that are still very much part of the community. And then I was surprised, even though, I guess it's maybe just a push for the media or something like that, that the population is still quite large in the city, and that the makeup of the city, from what I was finding statistically, has a lot of minorities to it. And I guess do all those things that you have found, I guess, are have probably greatly impacted your programming. And so when you are, when the, I don't know if you were there at the beginning or close to the beginning, but I guess what brought the idea of Brilliant Detroit together? Obviously, I know that there was a need, but what, I guess, was the main trigger?
I think often, like, if you hear our founder talk about, the ideation of Brilliant Detroit, she often call it crazy and wild. But her and our co-founders really were coming at it from, they had been a part of many initiatives. So Cindy Eggleton, who's a co-founder, really had worked in philanthropic efforts for many years. She had run a nonprofit, and then she had also worked for United Way as a program officer, overseeing millions in grants that were, being allocated throughout the city. And she really talked about like this idea that there was always something new coming about, and that solution was, okay, let's try this, but not always evidence based. And I think that is something you hear, her definitely speak to our staff a lot about, is the fact that we will try what our neighbors and our community folks want us to try, but also when it comes to literacy programming and those supports that we're going to deliver for children that are based in, development and growth, that brain growth, we're really going to lean hard on partners and programs that are evidence based. And so, there are a lot of things that folks have wanted to try in education over the last, I'd say, 15 to 25 years. But when it comes to literacy and brain development and early talk, the programs that are core programming and activities that exist at all of our hubs, really are evidence based, and creating this model, that at the center is a relationship with the community hub and the trust between the parents, the children, and that staff at that hub. I think one of the things we always uplift is not only do we build out the hub with the community, but the community also staffs the hub. It is very important to our mission that, each of the staff members that we select to work within the hub, the goal is to try and get somebody from the neighborhood, because we think the fidelity of delivering those programs, even if they, are evidence-based, the key and the magic is so often that trust and that relationship building. Someone being able to call and say, look, we're having a really hard time today. We can't get there for tutoring, and being able to share with somebody they trust, like what's happening in that family dynamic, so that person can help them overcome that barrier, or they can say, hey, let's reschedule, let's do that later in the week, or let's deal with whatever you have in front of you right now, and then we'll get back to that tutoring or that programming, when it's more feasible for you and your family. But I think there's, and I've experienced this myself. I worked in school education reform, and I used to cover children and families as a reporter. And it's just, there's so many things that you see folks try, and, it'll be tried for a year. It might be tried for as little as 6 months. But really the key with brilliant programming is how do you deliver things that have, really already shown that they can make an impact, and then how do you deliver those in a way that's, really has a community-based staff at its center, so that your families know if it's not working for them. We can also have the conversation about, hey, this isn't working, and evaluate like if we need to bring in something else.
Mm-hmm. Now, you brought up a good point of, right now, I think the pandemic really highlighted the holes that we have in the U.S. With our education system. And one of the things is, like you mentioned before, that you had already been part of the educational system in your own personal career, that trying new things or things that are, deviate from what we, the typical way that we think about education in the U.S., always kind of raise a flag. And so one of the things that I looked at in your organization, and I was thinking, because of course during the pandemic, the biggest thing was obviously the schools were closed, and then a lot of parents not having maybe an educational background, or not knowing where to start or help their kids, or they had to go to work, of course, or they're working from home. Of how to kind of, manage all of this. I think a lot of parents had I guess for lack of better terms, a meltdown in their own homes. Like, here I am. I'm already like, a mom. I have a job, and now I got to be a teacher, and now I got to like, do my regular, daily like just life. And I think a lot of people were having meltdowns. To say that, that's what I call it, just like, meltdowns in their homes. And so, since you already had kind of this program, how did you, or how are you tackling like this new virtual learning environment? Because I'm not sure if I know different areas have went to kind of hybrid, where they're still at home and then they go in some days, or maybe they went fully back, but then if somebody has like, a COVID outbreak, then everybody's back at home again. So since you guys were already kind of in this, what I'm calling kind of a future model of education, how did you tackle that during like the pandemic and how are you doing that in this like virtual learning time?
I think definitely pivoted and pivoted really fast. I think to the credit of, the Brilliant Detroit board, the Brilliant Detroit leadership, there was a pivot to virtual and how to deliver programs virtual. But also a lot of thought really put into how do we connect with families in the safest way to get them also the things that they need. And so, our goal in a typical time period pre-COVID was, delivering literacy programs, doing development programs, for infants and our toddlers and getting moms together, getting grandparents together for exercise and health and nutrition things that were all in person and really dependent upon those interpersonal relationships. But I think that because we had those relationships and we had the trust, what Brilliant really saw during COVID was an immediate ask of the families to say, like, we don't know what to do for these other things. I think there was, of course, the childcare and the school issues with those closures. But our team immediately pivoted to start distributing food boxes, to distribute learn at home kits, to sign families up for emergency Wi-Fi and low cost, internet, and to distribute devices, tablets and Chromebooks to families, books. In the first weeks, we had families that didn't have formula and enough diapers.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we create safe drive-by activities so that families could access those things from the hubs? But then once they had the devices and the ability to access Wi-Fi, how do we then also just create the space to have conversations? Because I think that, we talk about there's a privilege in being able to kind of break down and have a crisis. I know that, I was amongst the families who had that privilege of being able to work from home, have my children at home. I had a partner who was at home. And so there was a lot of crashing that happened in the, I would say, 2.5 years. But, I think what our families experienced was a lot different. Because they didn't have some of those tools. Our schools didn't immediately hand out devices. It took a lot of community organizing and some philanthropic partners and folks coming together to make sure that eventually that happened. But I would say that a lot of the nonprofits leaned in to really get materials and resources to families kind of in that gap. And I'd say our founder really talks about, we did deliver programming and we did eventually see many of the things that we had in person go online and, we're able to get some of the tutoring happening. But what was more important was we were also just to create a space for people to talk and to connect. We couldn't hug. We couldn't sit on the porch together in that same way. We couldn't have those community dinners. So I think really important part of that virtual connection was like being able to see each other, being able to let the children, just talk without an agenda. And so those relationships and that trust, I think that really played out virtually in that way. And still to this day, if you get the families online, it may take, probably 15, 20 minutes to get everybody, grouped because they really that connection, what was so needed. And I say particularly for Detroit because I think there are several places in the country that, remained hotspots for COVID long after other folks were, starting to go back to, a post-COVID normal, we call it. Um,
Mhm.
but, our families are still experiencing a lot of loss. And we experienced loss really early on, and so I think that was also important to create space for families to say, yes, we're here to help you with learning, we're here to help you figure out, that crazy second grade curriculum that nobody understands, but we're also here to talk about the fact that, like, we're losing friends and we're losing family, and our kids and our participants really lost a lot of people in the last 3 years.
Yes, you bring up I think one of the biggest points that a lot of maybe organizations or even people miss is that, okay, yes, we all of course had to go into crisis mode during the pandemic and take care of how are we going to work, how are we going to get food. But the biggest thing I think you highlighted is that you guys offered the ability of how do you process trauma, essentially to everybody, because that's what everybody was dealing with, um, and that is, not that the other things are not as important, but of course, that I think helps people in numerous ways that we don't know. Um, and so this brings me to the point that I want to kind of highlight to everyone is that how you offer your services out of homes. Can you explain why you chose to offer services out of homes instead of having buildings that everybody meets at?
Yeah, I think it's a very unique model. I think every time I meet somebody, they're really thrown aback, like I said, that it is an actual house. But again, it's going back to, you said it a few minutes ago, where there's been a lot of things tried in schools. There's been a lot of things tried just in general with children and families, the last 30 years. But if we look at, like, when, children were, like, actually flourishing, it's when we had that whole circle, when we had, neighbors that knew one another. They knew your parents, your principal knew your parents, your teacher knew your parents, and everything was, pretty close to your neighborhood. And that's not to say that, like, now that children, are expanding out and they may be attending school or childcare in some place that isn't their neighborhood, that's bad, because it's not bad. But how do we make sure that when you come back to that neighborhood, that the things you need to be set up for success, exist within that kind of, 5-10 block radius, that your parents can access tutoring for you, that if you need food, you're able to access food and safety and conversations of other parents. And I think so often when programs are created, and even funding is allocated, what we see is, hey, this is where we're going to offer it. This is the time we're going to offer it. And families are really asked to make that work. And the concept here with the community based hubs is really, planning for, with, by the community. Like, what, when, and how are we going to offer that? How will it be available, to them in a way that's accessible? If all of our parents are working, and not available for a 10 a.m. program, we're not going to try to offer a 10 a.m. program because of a grant. We're really going to, like, say, what does the families need? So that, again, this idea that you're not putting the burden on the families. I think so often there are things out there, but I have not yet visited a state or a county where a school administrator or, a nonprofit ED has asked me, well, how do we tap into families? And the answer is just very simple. It's like, how do you meet people where they're at? How do you not burden them, to find transportation when transportation may not be available? How do you, not, create a program at a time that's just never going to work for working families? And that's really the goal with the community hubs, is creating that almost old school sense of community that we used to have in each of our neighborhoods. So no matter where folks are going to school, or no matter where, their church may be, because those are even in different neighborhoods now, that they can have this hub from the time that a child is born until they may, start to interact more with their school community at the age of 8.
Mm-hmm. And so, in creating these hubs, and one of the big things that you just brought up is that a lot of schools, and I've seen it even in my own personal experience, is that a lot of times, things fall on the parents, especially, I would say, probably mostly in elementary school, probably dissipates a little bit in junior high, give or take, what your child is like. So in your organization, what role do parents take or play in the organization?
I'm trying to think. I think I would even push back on role. I think it's like our organization is parents. I think because we hire from within community, because we are often approached by community, there really isn't this distinction of like, this is the parent's role and this is like the staff's role. It really is a blend of like everything that everybody really desires for children. And so I think most of our team, are Detroit based staff members who've come from many of the neighborhoods. And so, they are parents, but they're also staff members. I think the same thing with our community advisory. Many of them are grandparents who are raising grandchildren. And so you have a lot of dual roles. But I think that for us, it's really this like child family centric attitude of everybody who's really, touching Brilliant. I think that was also what was attractive to me as an organization. I think you can attend meetings or participate in conversations, where children are never mentioned, what something could look or feel like or be experienced like for a child. And I think in our organization, that is always the forefront of everything. How will a family experience this? What will they be burdened if we plan it this way? And I think that, it would be hard for somebody to come into the organization and be like, oh, those are the parents, this is the staff. Because I think that everybody's focus and the way that we all kind of approach the work is it's really, what does this look and feel like for our families, whether you're a parent or not. But I think that there's no designated role, for the families. And I think that one of the beautiful things that's also happened because of that is many of our participants who've started maybe as a mother who's pregnant and attending a baby shower, that she can develop her skills and become a leader in the community and become an outreach staff member. And so I think that, that's also in the now 6 years that we've existed, in many of our neighborhoods, you really see that, somebody who started as a participant, has become somebody who's working within the staff, either as a community advisor or as an actual staff member.
Wow. One of the things that I'm feeling a lot of there's a lot of heart in the organization. I guess how have you been able to create that? Like one of the barriers I think that happens in a lot of organizations or school districts is this thing kind of like I do this, you do that, but you have described an organization where there's that it's more of a we than an I and an us and things like that. It's I guess, how have you created that secret sauce? Like, how have you brought people how do you do that? Because I think that's one of the hardest things. And if we could do that, everywhere, it would make a difference in, a bunch of different things.
Yeah, I think that, a lot of that credit definitely goes again towards the founders and towards the board, because realizing that doing that is well, it's the magic. It's also what's complex and hard in the work. And what makes the work sometimes messy, because we're not hiring often staff members who come in, with the skills of being in an office setting for 10, 12 years. And so email etiquette or, protocol for like time cards and all those things, those are not, things that we as a staff definitely come in, having mastered. I met with somebody who's just amazing connecting with community 2 weeks ago, and I was trying to show her the ups and downs of social media. And she just looked at me and she was like, this is not my jam. And, and we had to pivot. We had to say, you know what, it's not your jam. And like, what is the system and the process that we're going to build to accomplish the things that we need to accomplish? Because, social media is all about messaging. How do we get the message, to the families we're trying to serve? But that's not her medium. So how do we do that in a way that's also respectful, to the staff and to the dynamic, superpowers that they have to connect to people one-on-one? And I totally credit that to the leadership of the organization, because it's constantly asking these questions of like, we need to tackle X, but that isn't necessarily the skill set of this staff member, or that's not what we want the focus of that team to be. And so like, how do we reach that goal, but really do it in a way that's, human centered, that you're not, having someone come to work and do something they hate every day, but you're creating the environment where they are respected for those gifts and talents. And I think also, the team is really good about coming up with solutions. I think that, we definitely during COVID have experienced a lot of barriers as a community, but like, how do we use those talents to come up with solutions? And I think that the heart of that is just like Brilliant itself, is like, how do you really respect like the individual and that person who is a mom, who's a community member, and like the skills they're bringing. Because that's why folks come to Brilliant. They don't come to Brilliant because we're really good at Facebook ads. And so I think everybody should own that, like, that's hard, doing that. I don't think there's something about it that's easy, because, we're not necessarily using traditional training manuals or, going about things in, I think, the most traditional way. But what does happen, I think, for each staff member is really a respect to the, beautiful capacity and like talents that they bring.
I'm just I have to say I'm amazed, because I haven't. There's very few organizations that I hear such I guess such kind of oneness with. And so I guess I have to ask: has there been like a big barrier that you've had to overcome, besides, of course, the pandemic?
I think the barrier that we talk about the most is also how do you maintain that magic as we continue to grow? So we started out with 1-2 hubs. We will have 24 by 2024. And I think that if my founder were here, if Cindy was on the line with us, she would definitely say, what we're consistently thinking about is how do we make sure that as we grow, that key secret sauce of those relationships, and that every hub feels that way, that every Brilliant Detroit activity feels that way. If you approach us and we're at a Girl Scout event, that the team is trained in such a way that like it feels like Brilliant Detroit. And those things are important. When I talk to other nonprofits, I'm constantly asking questions, and they'll be like, what do you mean? How does our team do outreach? And there is a feeling of Brilliant Detroit that we want to make sure that each participant or stakeholder or community member who like interacts with us, that they walk away with that same feeling of like welcomeness and openness. And I think that what we're trying to be really protective of is like, how do you make sure you are able to do that as you continue to grow? Because we know that the need now more than ever still exists. And so we have, I think at this point, 7 neighborhoods on our waiting list. We have 2 other, I think, cities in other parts of the country that would love to see Brilliant Detroit replicate. And even outside of the country, our board and our leadership have been approached about replication. But I think what everybody's really protective of is, how do you make sure that what you experience, that nurturing love, the way that everybody feels safe in that hub, and the way that the staff and the participants are given room to grow, continues to exist, and I think feel the way that it did from our start in 2016, that it feels that same way, and it's that same kind of overwhelming sense of love that has existed from that start. That, how do we maintain that into 2024 as we, expand, I'd say double, triple from where we came from.
Yes. And speaking of expansion and I guess a need for Brilliant Detroit in other areas, of course, may be called Brilliant, different name than the Detroit if it's in a different city. But one of the things I think I watched an interview with your founder, Cindy Eagleton, that you had like an expansion possibility, or you were testing out Chicago as another one of the areas that might need such a program. And so in doing that, I guess how I'm asking, I guess now practical questions, because of course every city is a little bit different. How do you guys go around selecting properties for the organization?
So I think with that growth, there's come the planning on the staff side, that there's actually a whole dedicated staff and team members who are meeting monthly, I think more at this point, more often than monthly, to really discuss what that replication looks like. I think alongside a board member participating as well, like what does that selection process look like and what are those criterias? And so just really thoughtfully making that its own work stream as far as expansion, in addition to like our day-to-day operations, that there is a team of folks, who really have a set of allocated hours and brain space to be able to think what that looks like. Because again, the fidelity of the model, if it is to be replicated, our co-founders have been really clear that they want to make sure that it's the right city. They want to make sure that it's the right space and the right time. And then also that the stakeholders and the community members that are in that city, that it's something that they want, and not something that's being sought by, a funder or an outside entity, if that makes sense. But, I think the same way we have our neighborhoods really approach us here, how do you have it be a neighborhood who's really seeking that Brilliant Detroit model and not necessarily like one individual? So I think that's really at the heart of that, making sure that that exists. But then there's also all the other elements that go into it. What is the landscape as far as properties? How hard is it to get, a blighted or vacant or foreclosed property in that particular city? And there's definitely some cities who have an interest where like that's harder than it is in others. So like Chicago, it may be easier to do that than a Philadelphia or, another city on the, west side of the country. So I think there's a lot of thought that goes into it. And I think that our co-founders are also really committed to how do we get to our 24, before those replication decisions and plans are really firmed up as well.
Mm-hmm. And so how can people help your organization?
Number one thing that we always tell people is just share. So whether it's Facebook or LinkedIn or, Instagram, or even, grabbing something from one of those places and sharing the link to our website, just letting more people know about us. You can now be a virtual tutor to a child in Detroit from anywhere. You log into Zoom after getting a background check, of course, and tutor training. But being a literacy mentor has never been easier, because now that we have so many of our families that have the access, they can go to school during the day or attend their childcare program. And then if they feel like there's, a readiness or a reading gap, we can sign them up with a virtual mentor. And, 30 to 40 minutes a day, like, we just see huge difference in kids. It's that confidence level that you get from reading with a buddy or a friend each afternoon, really can just help our children take off. I think the stats are a little bit higher now, but I mean, generally under 20% of our third graders in Detroit are reading on grade level. And for us, our North Star is really, how do we change that? By third grade, if you're not set up to be a reader who is on target and who's able to read and comprehend, we know you're going to struggle with math. We know you're going to struggle with, all those lessons that are going to come in middle school. And so how do we really, get every child who wants to be matched up with their virtual reading mentor matched up? But brilliantdetroit.org is our website, and all of our volunteer opportunities are on there. If somebody's in Detroit and is curious about where our houses are located, all of our locations are also listed at brilliantdetroit.org.
Fantastic. And I just have two more questions for you. So I don't know, do you have a favorite story about the organization?
My favorite story. Oh my gosh, there's just so many. I think the thing that definitely comes to mind, and like a recent why, is I had the real kind of crazy privilege of helping with our annual event this year. And it was the first time we had our funders, our volunteers, our board members, and our families come together as a group. And it was one of those situations, where I think all of us were like, everybody's just ready to have fun. I think that as I've traveled throughout the country, it feels like other cities were able to move forward a lot faster than those hot spots where COVID just really hit the hardest. And so we knew families were ready for fun. But we also knew it would be hard to get, 400 plus people together in an environment that was both formal, but, family friendly. And there was a point in the evening at I think it was like nine something, where this child was just up on this fancy statue dancing with silent disco headphones on their head. And just turned to me and, said, "This is the most fun I've ever had in my life. And I just thank you so much." And, after 3 really hard years, there are obviously lots of stories that are way more dramatic than that, and probably, more connected to academics and literacy. But it was just such a relief to us all that children were able to be in a space with their moms, their dads, their grandpas, in community, and just be kids. And I think that, as we think about all the things that really need to happen in the next couple of years, I think we do have readiness gaps, and we do have, things that need to be addressed with communities and our children as far as academics. But we also need to recognize, like we said, that, children and families really need love, safety. And when you have love and safety, what we like to emphasize is then you can grow. But you can't grow if you don't have those two things, for sure.
I like that story. Yes, it's something light after we've dealt with so many heavy things in these last few years. And so my final question kind of, I guess it's kind of like a question. It's a statement that I want you to finish. So here's the statement that I need you to finish. It takes a village.
It takes a village to create love and safety.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for your insight and sharing with us all about Brilliant Detroit and the changes that you are making. So thank you, Ms. Montoya, for your time and insight. To learn more about Brilliant Detroit, go to brilliantdetroit.org. If you have a passion for an underserved community, a social justice problem, or want to change minds, contact Project Good Work at projectgood.work to start your project of change today. We would like to send our deepest gratitude to our ongoing show supporter, Blair Chapman. Subscribe to our mailing list at projectgood.work/subscribe to get our episode and blog articles sent to you each month, plus get a 10% discount on any project you start on projectgood.work. Thank you to our listeners, and thank you for tuning to Project Good, where we're focused on what matters.